Thank you all for attending today's webinar, which is organized by the Center on Asia and Globalization, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. My name is Denis and I'm Senior Research Fellow at the Center. The topic of today's webinar is Building an ASEAN Economic Community Beyond 2025, which draws on our most recent publication by the Center of the same title. The edited volume is publicly available on our website to download, and I think that was also circulated on social media about a week ago. As many of you know, the ASEAN Secretariat as well as ASEAN officials are currently in the midst of preparing the next strategic plan for the ASEAN Economic Community. So the existing AEC Blueprint will end by 2025. So we brought together experts, both academics and practitioners, to share their thoughts and views, as well as to generate new ideas of what we think is quite some of the important themes and issues post-2025 that should be included in the new strategic plan. So this edited volume publication is one of the deliverables for that project. And in that publication, we have about 5 key chapters covering pertinent issues related to digital transformation, institutional readiness to achieve carbon neutrality, narrowing the development gap, expectations of businesses on the AEC, and addressing AEC's enforcement mechanisms. 2 of our authors today will be speaking at the webinar, and they'll be sharing their views and contributions to that publication. And they will be covering, as I mentioned earlier, basically topics related to expectations of the private sector businesses, as well as enforcement mechanisms. My co-editor, Dr. Julia Tijada, will cover the other 3 chapters. And what I'll do after the presentation is to try to tease out some of the common themes or commonalities that we found from those 5 chapters, which I think are quite important in terms of moving forward with the AEC. So without further ado, let me quickly introduce our speakers today. Firstly, my co-editor, Julia Tijaja, is an ASEAN trade and global value expert. She's also an associate senior fellow at the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute, which is jointly under the ASEAN Studies Center and the Regional Economic Studies Program. She is also currently the head of markets and competitiveness at Prospera, the Australia-Indonesia Partnership for Economic Development, where she heads Prospera's portfolio on expanding markets, creating jobs. Prior to joining Prospera, Julia was director of the ASEAN Integration Monitoring Directorate at the ASEAN Secretariat, where she worked on key regional initiatives, including COVID-19 recovery, economic integration monitoring, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, Free Trade Agreement, and as well as the midterm review on the AEC Blueprint 2025. Our next speaker is Mayes Alcancel. She's an international trade expert with 18 years of experience on international trade policies and negotiations, particularly on advancing trade and sustainable development initiatives through expanding market access, leveraging trade facilitation tools, and free trade agreements. Mayes began a career as a trade negotiator for the Philippines from 2005 to 2014. After that, she was the head of Free Trade Agreements, FTA's International Relations Department at the Singapore Business Federation, where she helped to develop FTA education and outreach programs, among other things. She's also worked with the International Trade Center, ITC, as the National Project Coordinator for the EU-funded ARISC plus Philippines project from 2021 to 2022. Our third speaker is Dr. Tan Sian Lee. She is assistant professor at NUS School of Law. She's also the co-editor of the Center of International Law and editor of the Asian Journal of International Law. Sian Lee was, until recently, senior research fellow and executive director of the ASEAN Integration Through Law project at the Center of International Law at the National University of Singapore, an affiliation she still maintains. Sian Lee has held fellowships at the European University Institute, Florence, the Jean Monnet Center for International Regional Economic Law and Justice, NYU School of Law, and she's also held research fellowships, both at NUS and also in Japan. So without further ado, let me start off by inviting Julia to kick off the webinar.
Thank you, Denis, and good afternoon, everyone. So I think for the next 20 minutes, I will try and cover and give you a summary of the 3 chapters in our publication. And I think just to reiterate what Denis mentioned just now, that the ASEAN Economic Community, or the ASEAN community more broadly, is really at the coming to a very important period, where it's in the process of basically covering the last milestone of the ASEAN Community 2025, but also developing its vision and strategy for beyond 2025. And all these are taking place in an era where the world has significantly changed, both in terms of some of the trends, the imminent trends that we know are coming from climate change and digitalization, but also the more recent shocks, as we've seen, for example, in the area of security as well. So the first of the 3 chapters in our edited volume covers the ASEAN Digital Community 2045. This was written by Lilian Ng and her co-authors at ERIA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. And then the second chapter is actually on the ASEAN strategy for carbon neutrality, focusing on how to move it forward. This is written by Melinda Martinez of ICEA's Yusuf Ishak Institute. And the third chapter is on the narrowing the development gap for an inclusive economic community post-2025. This is written by Rases Shrestha, Aladdin Rilo, and Safadar Buban of ERIA. So you have a good mix of contributors from ASEAN experts, researchers, but also practitioners contributing to this work. Taking these 3 chapters together also seems quite appropriate, because even though they look at different issues, they are all similarly cross-cutting and multidimensional. And to an extent, they also do not intuitively follow ASEAN pillar and sector-specific institutional and decision-making structure. Let me start with the ASEAN Digital Community 2045. So in this chapter, we started off by highlighting both the scale, but also the significant shift that is brought about by digital transformation. When it comes to numbers, it do seem that ASEAN is actually quite well positioned to benefit from this digital transformation. But personally, I'm always on the other side when I talk about numbers in digital. The digital transformation is quite a recent phenomenon. And at the moment, I think everyone are still working together to try and come up with a more robust measurement of digital progress. But in short, ASEAN digital trade is expected to reach 1 trillion by 2030. This is about 10% of global. There has been a more recent estimate that if ASEAN is able to agree on an ambitious ASEAN Digital Economic Framework Agreement, it can in fact double these targets. And ASEAN benefit to a large extent from its relatively young population for now, because we know that the aging population is also quite imminent. And the fact that 80% of our 670 million population actually have access to the internet. Quite a lot of them are engaged in e-commerce, or even in activities such as online transport, food delivery, and so on. Although the adoption at the more productive activities at the firm level is probably more limited or concentrated. Now, beyond the statistics, and I'm not going to list out all the different documents, ASEAN has been making strides in terms of its digital economy cooperation. Numerous documents have been adopted, frameworks on personal data protection, for example, digital integration framework and its action plan. ASEAN has also agreed on an updated agreement on e-commerce and also adopted a detailed work plan for its implementation. ASEAN has also elevated its telecommunication cooperation to one that is more broad-based, covering digital economy and e-commerce. More technical documents such as the ASEAN Data Management Framework, model contractual clauses for cross-border data flow has also been adopted as well. At the more strategic level, following the pandemic, ASEAN has also adopted the ASEAN Bandar Sri Begawan roadmap that tried to leverage on digital economic integration as a way to accelerate post-pandemic recovery in the region. And of course, most recently, just last year, ASEAN has also announced the commencement of the negotiation for the ASEAN Digital Economic Framework Agreement. And this is in fact, the commencement is in fact an accelerated one, because in the Bandar Sri Begawan roadmap, it was expected to actually start in 2025. So its negotiation has actually started 2 years early, and with which frameworks for negotiation was also adopted. And just earlier this year, we hear that ASEAN has also adopted its the guidelines for AI governance and ethics. Now, all these are very commendable, but a lot of we note that a lot of the focus of ASEAN digital work has been on the development of different frameworks, strategies, and action plans. What was highlighted in the chapter is that this approach has some limitations, particularly in terms of ensuring the following endorsement and adoption of these documents. So if it's an action plan and it has regional activities or initiatives, it's relatively more straightforward to monitor through the different sectoral body reporting mechanism. But when it comes to follow-up that is required at the national level, there is at the moment little in place to actually monitor the real progress towards the intended objectives. And typically, when monitoring is being done beyond the regional initiatives, it may also be focused at the more broad-based, percentages calculated based on what are actually being addressed and discussed. So in the paper, it is proposed that the ASEAN Digital Community 2045 give a refreshed approach to ASEAN digital transformation by looking at one that is more holistic, through the formulation of a more comprehensive vision that can drive the ASEAN longer-term digital transformation agenda. And it will also be an approach that will overcome ASEAN pillar and sectoral specific institutional structure as well. It is proposed that the ASEAN digital community look at 5 elemental pillars covering governance, and this include data governance, but also the issues of, for example, cybersecurity, competition, consumer protection, also the issue of productivity. And this is extremely important because the digital sector should not be treated in silo as a standalone cooperation, but in fact, the biggest impact of digital transformation is through the adoption across the different economic sectors, including the more traditional ones. Connectivity, which is basically the backbone of our digital transformation. And here we are talking about infrastructure, both digital and physical, hard and soft. And when you talk about hard infrastructure, here we have to talk about investment, financing, and the quality of the infrastructure as well. Inclusivity focuses more on the ensuring that the broad benefits from digital transformation. And here we are talking about digital literacy, skills, and access. And last but not least is sustainability as well. Digital transformation, to an extent, provide an opportunity for us to reduce our carbon footprints, but it does not come at no cost to the environment. The increasing use of data is actually requires energy-intensive data centers, but also the significant use of land and water as well. And similarly, the demand for smart products requires the increased use of semiconductors and all the different input that goes into that, including critical minerals. And last but not least, of course, the digital transformation is also not immune to geopolitical strategic competition as well. And in terms of what is actually being proposed, the chapter actually recognized that AEC will continue to take the lead on digital economy initiatives, but it calls for for a way to actually address ASEAN digital transformation in a more holistic sense by, again, having a holistic vision, but also a platform that allows for cross-pillar discussions and communication. And such a platform should be focused on providing an opportunity for the different sectors and pillars to update relevant initiatives and developments on digital-related issues, to help them work together to jointly identify risks and opportunities, as well as areas for collaborative work. Such a platform should also be kept open so that you can actually also, ASEAN can also engage with relevant stakeholders, including industry experts, private sector, and civil society representatives. And all these are very important in terms of resource mobilization, but also most importantly, ensuring relevance and impact as well. Lastly, the authors close the chapter by highlighting what are some of the factors that will ensure the success of ASEAN digital community, that is ensuring, again, that cross-pillar and cross-sectoral cooperation, ensuring that all these regional objectives and commitments are actually complemented by national level of initiatives and implementation as well, and highlighting the need of tracking and monitoring progress of actions against these targets. It closes by highlighting the importance of human capital development to support digital transformation. I would then next move to the second chapter, which is on the ASEAN strategy for carbon neutrality by Melinda Martinez. So here, basically, Melinda started off by highlighting ASEAN member states' commitments towards limiting the rise in global temperature under the Paris Agreement. She also touched on how ASEAN is well positioned to basically use collective efforts to add value to their respective individual commitments. And she highlighted this because ASEAN already have regular convening mechanism for cooperation in different relevant areas like transport, energy, and food and agriculture. ASEAN also have platform for engagement with external partners, including international organizations. ASEAN also have a broad networks of institutions with their different expertise, such as the ASEAN Center of Energy. And ASEAN has the strength to actually make joint targets as well, as seen as the target that they've made on the reduction of energy intensity that has been surpassed in 2018, surpassing its 2020 target, but also in terms of the share of renewables in energy mix, which I think is still the work in progress. Melinda further highlight that amid all this, ASEAN has also been facing increasing external pressures from its major trading partners to better align its climate policies with global standards. Take an example, for example, like the AEC Beyond, which has the intention of actually introducing level playing field with domestic firms that are subjected to strict standards, but ultimately the devil will be in the details, right? And we note also there has been some recent pushback, but the direction of the policy, as we've seen in how other countries has also mentioned their intention to adopt similar policies, all will call for ASEAN to economies and firms to increase their capacity for carbon reporting and also to anticipate possible transitory higher costs, at least in the short term. At the same time, she also argued that it is important for ASEAN to also craft its own narrative on carbon neutrality, given the important role that the region has in contributing to carbon reduction. And also given the differentiated situation that ASEAN member countries already have, some of us are commodity dependent, others are probably more advanced in technology, and so on and so forth. Then to this end, the endorsement of the ASEAN strategy on carbon neutrality is actually a key milestone for ASEAN, because now we have a collective commitment on how to work together to address climate change along with economic growth. Now, this is, of course, not the first time for ASEAN to come together on this issue. Prior to this, we already have the framework for circular economy for the AEC. And from the finance side, we are now at the third version of the taxonomy for sustainable finance, which actually serve as a common language across the different jurisdictions to coordinate and communicate different economic activities and financial instruments. But again, the challenge in ASEAN is the fact that the environmental sector and, for example, the disaster sector actually comes under the different pillars. And within the ASEAN community, different sectors that actually can contribute to both carbon emission, but also carbon reduction are actually addressed in the different sectors. You have energy, transport, for example, and agriculture, high emitting sectors, but you also have investment and finance, for example, they can actually offer solutions on how ASEAN can reduce its carbon footprint. Very briefly touching on the strategy, I won't go into the details, but the ASEAN strategy on carbon neutrality work towards 4 key outcomes. The first one is to develop its green industries. The second one is to improve interoperability within ASEAN. This includes interoperability of its electricity systems to align ASEAN to globally credible standards. So ASEAN will continue to become an attractive destination for capital to support us in green transition and to develop green capabilities. And all this will be done through the 8 strategy, ranging from green value chain integration, circular economy, green connectivity of infrastructure and markets, standards is already mentioned, green capital, and again, green talent development, mobility, and best sharing practices. The key recommendations from this chapter highlights that the success of this milestone strategy will depend on its effective operationalization. And again, this strategy is one that is multi-sectoral, cross-pillar, and multi-stakeholders. Melinda proposes that to successfully operationalize this, ASEAN can focus on prioritizing impactful initiatives. Prioritization can be done by focusing on sectors that are major greenhouse gas emitters, such as on the energy and land use, and on those that can actually have a greatest growth contribution in terms of investment and also creation of employment. And also as well as those cooperation that can contribute to the vision of the ASEAN community by focusing on interoperability, exchange, as well as alignment with ensuring global credibility. She then highlighted the importance of, and again, this relates to implementation, of having measurable monitoring and evaluation framework, having those clear metrics and targets, as well as having a baseline assessment to know where ASEAN stands now and be able to progress to track the progress of the implementation of the strategy, and having a system to monitor, evaluate, and report on those progress. The third recommendations involve around the setting up of the coordinating body. Again, this is not an implementing body, but rather a body to help coordinate and oversee the various initiatives outlined in the strategy, ensure communication, collaboration, and alignment among the different sectoral bodies, but also ASEAN member states. This could then contribute to more efficient efforts, resource allocation, progress monitoring, and addressing any implementation barriers. It can also help to enhance transparency, accountability, and feasibility of the efforts. But last but not least, which is very important, she also highlights that when it comes to tangible implementation, again, it is very important to actually leverage on existing sectoral bodies. And in her chapter, she actually mapped out how the 8 strategies relate to the different sectoral bodies under both the ASEAN Economic Pillar and the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community Pillar. Last but not least is the chapter on narrowing development gap for inclusive economic community. Denis, is it okay if I take another 4 minutes for this?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So on this again, the authors Rashes Sesta and his co-author highlighted how ASEAN has made significant progress on policy on community building in the area of AEC, particularly on trade integration. But what remain questions is whether the benefits has been enjoyed broad-based by the different stakeholders. And it was also highlighted that at the end of the day, access to factors, this will be determined by access to factors that's necessary to benefit from economic integration. And many of those factors are actually at the national level, infrastructure, institution, but also capital, finance, and skills that will benefit more from market integration. So the authors highlighted that ASEAN has achieved significant economic growth and improvement in various economic metrics, especially since the late 1990s, where ASEAN is it's in the form that it is now. But there is still significant gaps remain among members. For example, in terms of GDP per capita, Singapore is at the moment at about the third highest in the world, and then you have Myanmar at 148. And in nominal terms, Singapore is basically 26 times richer than Myanmar. And gaps are also seen across different other dimensions of development as well, both the one that reflect the current level of development or those that could also determine the future directions of development, such as that on human capital. The authors emphasize that it is important for ASEAN to incorporate a forward-looking strategy on how to narrow the development gap in its next economic integration agenda. And it needs to do that by both building of ASEAN progress to date, but also addressing emerging challenges such as supply chain restructuring, technology of advancement, climate change, demographic transition, and so on. The authors also warn that the existing development gap can confluence with emerging challenges and lead to an even wider development gap in the future. The authors then go by reviewing two main frameworks that's currently being used to progress ASEAN narrowing development gap agenda. The first one is on the Initiative for ASEAN Integration. This was launched in 2000 and focuses on helping the then newer ASEAN member states, that's Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, in integrating into the regional community. And work it's based on the successive work plans of the Initiative for ASEAN Integration, with funding from the ASEAN 6 as well as external partners. And the authors find that in a number of areas, there's quite limited scope of engagement with the relevant sectoral bodies. So typically priority areas, the strategic planning part of identifying priority areas and the plan outcomes went through quite intensive consultations with the different sectoral bodies. But when it comes to the activities level, sometimes it tends to be more ad hoc. And there is a less clear link between the different activities with the actual, with the intended outcomes. There is also the issue of coordination because there are different stakeholders involved. You have the IAI task force that's basically comprised of members of the Committee of Foreign Representatives, they are the ambassadors. You also have national coordinator in each of these relevant member states and coordinator for each of the strategic areas. And the frequent change of coordinators and PIC for the different strategic areas sometimes result in the lack of continuity. And on the second framework, which is the ASEAN Framework for Equitable Economic Development, this is a more broad-based development matrix across and within, looking at metrics across and within ASEAN and across the different sectors. The work was first assisted by the World Bank in the 2014 and most recently updated by the ADB in 2023. And although the metrics are more comprehensive from the Initiative for ASEAN Integration, at the end of the day, there is not much of an established mechanism on how to then implement the vision of this more broad-based equitable development framework. And when it comes to the reporting of the work as well, there is still also quite a heavy focus on differentiating between the ASEAN 6 and the Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And with the absence of a mechanism to actually support lagging sub-regions within the ASEAN 6, as well as to address other dimensions of development. So the authors, again, going to the recommendations, the authors mentioned that in the post-2025 agenda, the narrowing development gap should basically transcend the concepts of looking at it solely from the perspective of the 6 original member of ASEAN member states and the CLMV, also anticipating that we also now have Timor-Leste as observer to ASEAN, and to also have a more holistic and updated view of narrowing development gap, taking into account of the range of emerging issues faced by the different region. One possible metric, like updated narrowing development gap framework that the authors propose, cover the areas such as economic integration and market access. So that's very AEC. Human resource development and productivity enhancement. So these address both the welfare aspect, but also the future potential growth. Digitalization and technology adoption, because digital and technological divide actually contributes to widening development gap, and also giving recognition to the importance of institutional reform and capacity building, climate adaptation and resilience, as well as social welfare and inclusion. So this is just like an example of framework that they offer as a way to look at narrowing development gap from a broader dimension. Authors also highlight the need to ensure that the new approach will have a deeper and more comprehensive engagement with the sectoral bodies in addressing development gaps, and not only in that strategic planning and outcomes identification period, but also in developing the different and implementing the different activities. So again, to this end, they also recommending here the support of the coordinating committee that should be established to help oversee and manage the different narrowing development gaps projects. And the committee should have the technical capacity to work closely with the relevant sectoral bodies to develop various projects and programs, and also coordinate with different cooperation platforms, including at the sub-regional level as well. And this would allow the existing initiative or ASEAN Integration Task Force to focus more on high-level coordination with the external development partners, focusing on mobilization of resources and support for technical cooperation. I think I think I'll stop there, Denis. Sorry for running over time. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. So Julia had to speak a little longer because she's covering 3 chapters, but let's try to, our next 2 presentations, let's try to keep it to within a 15 minutes each so that we'll have a bit more time for questions and answers. So Mayas, you're next.
Thanks, Denis. First of all, I'd like to, of course, thank LKYSPP, particularly CAG, and of course, especially to Denis and Julia for bringing us all together to have this publication that hopefully would be able to help ASEAN governments in coming up with the next strategic blueprint. So my presentation would be focusing on what the businesses really want from the ASEAN Economic Community. I think coming from both the government and the private sector, I've always been very focused on where can policies be aligned with business needs and interests, of course, especially within the region. So key messages of my article, the AEC has produced numerous declarations, frameworks, strategies, and action plans. Julia mentioned about it earlier, but the big question remains on whether or not it has delivered real benefits, especially to the business community, because based on utilization of initiatives, including FTAs, it remains low, as well as business sentiments. They continue to consistently raise concerns on the implementation of AEC commitments. Either they're not effectively addressing their concerns, business concerns, or they're not implemented at all. Also, one of the key messages of my article is businesses want practical solutions and practices that lead to tangible outcomes. So really, there's an emphasis on practical solutions and practices that lead to tangible outcomes. That's why it's very important to come up with practical and measurable strategies, not just to come up with ambitious and ambiguous commitments, but make sure that they're translated into real and practical terms. Of course, my recommendation is for the post-2025 AEC Blueprint to focus on strengthening the implementation of AEC commitments in a business-friendly manner by adopting trade facilitation, not only when it comes to the application of trade in goods, but it should be a systematic principle of ASEAN economic integration, which is actually included or embedded in the ASEAN Trade Facilitation Framework. Also to increase, which I've always been highlighting in all my engagements, speaking engagement, there is a need to increase the involvement of the business sector in the AEC integration process because they can provide feedback. Of course, they're the one utilizing all these commitments FTAs, would be the one to be able to provide solutions and even help in providing resources, expertise in coming up with all these or implementing all these commitments. So since of course, though the government, they do the design, they do the implementation, they come up with all these policies, it's really the private sector that are using all of these initiatives or commitments. And that's why I've always emphasized the need to strengthen the monitoring and evaluation mechanism of all the things that they're doing, so that make sure that whatever the governments in the region, they're adopting and implementing, they're really aligned with what businesses need. Okay, so I won't be taking so much time on that content. So the first one, and this is also one of what I always tell whenever I talk to governments, it's always very important from the start to understand what are the concerns of businesses. There's always a need to know what are the needs of businesses, because if we don't know the needs of the businesses, then of course, coming up with all these initiatives and commitments, definitely they won't be aligned with all those needs and interests. I'm sure everyone is aware of the issues of businesses. It's always about the lack of regulatory transparency or predictability and access to relevant information. And here I'm not only talking about the regulations particularly, but even all the initiatives and commitments of ASEAN. Most of the time, businesses are not aware of these commitments, these initiatives, and hence they won't be able to take advantage of them. The regulatory barriers to trade, of course, it's not about the regulations per se, but how these regulations are implemented. Sometimes there are a lot of inconsistencies among the laws, regulations, and policies in the region, and even how they're implemented when it comes to, for instance, procedures, even coming up with the set of criteria in implementing all these commitments. They're most of the time inconsistent. Also, and I guess this is something where we can see that the government actually can and definitely progress on, and it's the private sector engagement. So currently, of course, ASEAN is always highlighting the need to engage the private sector, but in reality, communication, consultation, and cooperation with businesses continue to be weak. Okay, so this is always, I also say, complexity is the enemy of implementation. We all know that AEC, since the beginning, they're always trying to address the long-standing issues of businesses. And so they come up with all these initiatives, for instance, the ASEAN Trade Repository, the ASEAN Tariff Finder. There's also a commitment on the notification of measures that include new or revisions to existing measures. However, when it comes to the design of these commitments, the contents and coverage, even the accurateness of the information that's included in these platforms, and the up-to-datedness of the information, and even the sustainability of keeping all these trade facilitation initiatives, most of the time, there's a problem with that. So for instance, the ASEAN Trade Repository in terms of the sustainability, it's a problem because the regulators who are responsible in providing the information have also a lot of work, day-to-day work that they need to focus on, and hence they don't really have time to do the implementation. And also the design, for instance, for the ATR, it's not business friendly. So it's very hard to navigate whenever I would want, for instance, I'm an exporter and I would want to export my product to a certain country in the region. It's hard for me to navigate to be able to obtain all the relevant information for that particular product alone. And also, in terms of reducing unnecessary trade burdens through regulatory cooperation, there's a commitment for ASEAN governments on harmonization, standardization, and mutual recognition. However, as we all know, when it comes to coming up with all these mutual recognition arrangements, it's still either little has been made or has been done on this, or some of even ASEAN countries are not implementing the commitments or the MRAs. So then, and of course, when it comes to the outcome, it's not maximized the way they wanted to have it, done in the region. Then streamlining and digitalizing trade compliance documentation and procedures. ASEAN single window is a very good example of this one. They've been discussing it. I joined the government as a trade negotiator in 2005, and the initial commitment was to establish the ASEAN single window by 2008, starting 2008. But we all know that up to now, the ASEAN single window, it's not fully implemented. Only a few documents are being exchanged among ASEAN governments. And there are times, and probably it happens most of the time, where the gateway actually is down. So, see, and that's why I think what Julia mentioned earlier about digitalization is very important. We need to have really good infrastructure to make sure that if you adopt digitalization, they're working. And then, of course, institutionalizing private sector engagement. As I mentioned, it's one of the key commitments of ASEAN. However, the way it's currently implemented, the private sector engagement, most of the time when they engage the business sector, when there's a new issue, for instance, most of the time it's a one time off. There's no continuous discussion about the issue. So when there's a new issue about, for instance, environmental sustainability, you need to engage the business sector from the start. And then when you try to come up what should be done, what should be the policy in the region, you need to continuously engage them. And then when you come up with the final outcome or final document, you need to make sure that you communicate with them. These are the things that we agreed upon on, and we would want to in the future, in when we come up with when we go to the implementation, we would want for you to support how we would want to do it. So that should be done in that way. Also, as we all know, the current ASEAN Joint Business Councils, and though of course they represent several or somehow significant, substantial number of businesses, but they may not be representative of the needs of small businesses and some industries. And that's why it's very important to also involve other key industry associations in the region that would be able to promote specific sectors or even the needs of small businesses. So when it comes to the recommendations, as mentioned, I have two main recommendations, which is to apply trade facilitation as a systematic principle, not only on trade in goods, but on trade in services and investments as contained in the ASEAN Trade Facilitation Framework. So it's not even a new concept or idea. It's actually part of the ASEAN Trade Facilitation Framework. Also, again, increasing private sector engagement. So why it's very important to adopt key trade facilitation principles whenever ASEAN would come up with new commitments, new regulations, new initiatives. It's basically because it promotes transparency and predictability, regulatory cooperation, simplification and digitalization, and of course, consultation and cooperation between the government and private sector. That would hopefully reduce unnecessary trade compliance costs and mitigate costly delays. So here the emphasis is unnecessary trade compliance costs. We're not saying for governments to eradicate or eliminate regulations. It's really more to reduce the unnecessary trade compliance costs that companies are facing. That would lead hopefully to, of course, increase or higher productivity, higher source diversification, and supply chain resilience. So when it comes to increasing private sector engagement, these are my proposals. These are what I see are practical and measurable strategies where we can really involve the private sector in the ASEAN economic integration process. So again, conduct regular information dissemination in layman's terms. The government, they have their own language. Business, they also have their own language. So it's very important that when we convey the messages to the businesses, it's something that's that they can understand based on business operations. And so it should be through outreach events, government websites. We should be taking advantage of the platforms that we develop, social media platforms as well. And here I'm proposing that we need do this both at the regional and national levels. Then leverage digital technologies. Julia mentioned about this earlier as well. So what are the digital technologies? Websites, social media platforms for wider and more inclusive private sector engagement, especially if we would want to target those companies that are located in rural areas, those outside of capital cities in the ASEAN region. That's very important. Then increase, of course, the use of the bespoke e-platform for ASEAN consultations with the private sector. There's actually a platform, e-platform, to consult the private sector in ASEAN, but it's not really utilized at the moment. So there's a need to, take advantage of that platform. Identify and partner with business support organizations. This is very important. Again, governments have limited time, resources, capacity. And it's very important that they partner with business support organizations so that there's a multiplier effect. So they convey all this information to the business support organizations, and then it would be the business support organizations making sure that their members are actually aware of these commitments. Then in addition to the ASEAN Business Advisory Council and Joint Business Councils, it is very important to also involve other key industry sectoral associations in the ASEAN economic integration process. For instance, when it comes to food, we have the AFBA, the ASEAN Food and Beverage Alliance. So we actually have all these sectoral industry associations, which we can also tap on when it comes to network and expertise. And this one, I actually adopted this from the APEC Business Advisory Council, because they always have business champions who would monitor the implementation of any commitments that they adopt, and even in the implementation. It's very important that there's someone is actually focused on making sure that it's implemented, that particular commitment is implemented. Then, of course, we need to foster more public-private partnerships in the region, because it's the only way I see where both the government and the private sector would come up with the best or the most suitable design and implementation of commitments in the region. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayes. Okay. Last but not least, Tianli, you're next.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much to the CAG team and for everyone listening in today. So I'm going to have a few slides to share. Here we are. So the main question in my chapter really looks at implementation and enforcement, right? In the AEC, we have been talking about many ambitions, 2 blueprints so far, and another one coming right up. And of course, in this more challenging international landscape, geostrategic, geoeconomic, geopolitical frictions, ASEAN is also trying to gain some leverage within this more complex environment. There is digitalization, there's climate change, but let's not forget that right at the start, when we embarked on ASEAN community building through the adoption of the ASEAN Charter. We wanted to integrate into a single market and production base so that we would be able to join up to global supply chains and also to be able to compete more effectively and efficiently with China and India. So that's quite a long time ago. And I think everyone is realistic about where ASEAN stands. So what I'm proposing in terms of, policy recommendations, yes, there should be new and more substantive policy recommendations in order to deal with our changing landscape, to deal with the new features of what we need to do in the trade and investment environment, right? Especially digital trade, the impact of the climate change, so on and so forth. But really, as what all the authors have been saying so far, implementation is key. Going back to basics, remembering what we agreed to do and how to do it, that's really, really important. So staying the course in ASEAN's rules-based order is really the theme of what I am emphasizing. So, in the beginning, when we adopted the ASEAN Charter and embarked on ASEAN community building, there was the idea by the Eminent Persons Group, by all the ASEAN member states, that we would look into enforcement. And many people thought that, okay, let's go the way of dispute settlement mechanisms. Dispute settlement mechanisms are important, but as we all know, they have not been triggered yet. So if we do not use dispute settlement mechanisms by way of litigation, how then can we enforce? How can we comply? How can we improve compliance? How can we implement better? The answer is really in ASEAN's evolving and solidifying practice in the rules-based order that we created. So I will walk everyone through this quite briefly. So in the ASEAN rules-based order, there is a bit of tension with the traditional ASEAN way as we know it, right? So the ASEAN way is non-formalistic, non-legalistic, but that's actually not the ASEAN rules-based order as we want it to be and how we have developed since 2007 through the adoption of the ASEAN Charter. The new ASEAN way, right? And in the new jargon of contemporary geopolitics of being rules-based and being this rules-based international order, ASEAN also has a rules-based ASEAN order. So how does ASEAN, or how did ASEAN rules-based order come about? What does ASEAN's rules-based order comprise? And what are the specific recommendations that will enhance our implementation, compliance, and enforcement within ASEAN's rules-based order of economic integration? So how our rules-based order came about, right? Through the ASEAN Charter of 2007, the charter was meant to give legal status to ASEAN. It's there in the ASEAN Charter, which is legally binding. It's, if you want to go to dispute settlement, the ASEAN Charter can be litigated for violations. So the ASEAN Charter says it is the institutional framework for ASEAN community building. The ASEAN Charter codifies all ASEAN norms and rules, right? So all of ASEAN's treaties that have been in existence, and also concretizes all the soft law commitments that ASEAN has produced in multitudes, right? For better accountability and compliance. So I think one thing that we need to remember, especially for member states, policymakers, those maybe working in the law, but might be discouraged by the lack of implementation and compliance and the lack of use of dispute settlement. Law doesn't undermine sovereignty, but it actually enhances sovereignty because we have made the commitment, we have made the obligation to bring about ASEAN Economic Community building. That's legally binding through the Charter. And that is the exercise of our sovereignty. So we cannot say that when integration exercises become difficult, then we want to renege because those integration rules, interfere with our sovereignty. No, sovereignty has been exercised by signing up to the ASEAN economic treaties and under the framework of the Charter. So the ASEAN Economic Community needs to be a single market and production base, right? We have the new factors coming in, digital framework agreement. There are more problems with supply chains, even as we try to make new, smoothen and enhance supply chains and connectivity. So now, what does ASEAN's rules-based order comprise? There are 4 characteristics under, the Charter umbrella or the Charter framework. So the Charter is our constituent treaty, right? And if we want to talk about exercise of sovereignty, sovereignty is very clear, very emphasized in the Charter. The Charter and ASEAN itself, we are an intergovernmental organization, right? So there are clear hierarchies of intergovernmental decision-making and power, and the centralized secretariat has clear delegated powers, right? From the summit right down to the national secretariats. So this framework, this intergovernmental hierarchy, sets the long-term integration goals in community building, right? And it is implemented, it should be implemented not just at the state-to-state level, but as many of my co-authors have mentioned, it should be done at the national level. And as Myers has already emphasized, the impact is really at the private sector. So what if the government think that, yes, we have so many laws and they seem to be working very well, but where do we see the outcomes? Do we see the impact? Private sectors, the ordinary people, the ASEAN societies are meant to get the advantages from the ASEAN single market and production base. That's what we need to measure. So another thing that I need to highlight is that, under ASEAN's intergovernmental regime of the Charter, there are many hard laws and soft laws, to which I will come to later. So hard laws meaning treaties, and declarations or blueprints, which are the soft laws that tend to elaborate and are the implementing programs of the hard laws. So now we come to this, right? So there is this system of primary and secondary laws where we have, for example, the Charter and the 3 blueprints accompanying the Charter. But now we're talking about the AEC. So the Charter is the primary law for ASEAN community building, and the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint is the secondary law that implements the ASEAN Economic Community Building program, right? The slew of programs. And there are also ASEAN treaties within this framework. So we can have the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, and there will be successive soft laws that implement in successive stages the ARTIGA, or, for example, in the ASEAN Investment Agreement. So another thing to emphasize is that, yes, perhaps in the international legal order, treaties are seen as very, very, significant, and soft laws such as declarations may seem to be less binding and are softer commitments, right? So, and they would then have the corollary of being less important. In the ASEAN, rules-based order, both hard laws, yes, hard laws are binding and litigable, but soft laws are commitments that are also should be taken very seriously and are increasingly taken seriously because they set out in firm language and with deadlines all the deliverables that need to be fulfilled, so that the primary laws such as the ASEAN Trade and Goods Agreement or the investment agreements, they can be fulfilled in the entirety. Now, moving next to the institutions of ASEAN, right? Hard laws, soft laws, and the charter framework. We need the institutions to bring about the fulfillment of implementation of compliance, and perhaps not in future enforcement via dispute settlement. So what are we really talking about in terms of implementation? Who is implementing? As I mentioned before, there is the intergovernmental hierarchy, right? But most importantly, we should see a lot more activity and implementation at the national level. International laws, ASEAN laws don't really have much effect until and unless the public and private sector at the domestic levels of the ASEAN member states give them real effect. And we need to see real outcomes, real growth, real development from the promises of ASEAN laws. Now I come to the ASEAN Integration Monitoring Directorate and the monitoring and evaluation framework. This is key, right? So as my colleagues have already mentioned, virtually in every chapter, we seem to hear that there needs to be better monitoring, there needs to be better evaluation of the goals and targets of the AEC, right? We set those targets, but we can't keep pushing back the deadlines. We need to meet them on time and then meet them in a meaningful way. So it is very promising that since, the time that the ASEAN community was launched in 2015, we now have the monitoring and evaluation framework. So many of us know how this works, but I think it's worth re-emphasizing. So first is compliance monitoring. When we have so many ASEAN laws, hard laws, soft laws, primary and secondary laws, compliance monitoring says these laws state you need to do A, B, and C. So compliance monitoring actually checks that. Have all 10 ASEAN member states implemented A, B, and C, right? And it must be genuine implementation. It cannot be in lip service or just, adopting legislation or national policy. That is not implemented by actual people in the public and private sector. Now that we have the laws at the national and at the national level, we then see outcomes monitoring, right? We evaluate outcomes monitoring because we are trying to measure whether we have economic progress, more jobs, higher national income. How do, the goals of ASEAN integration bring about these positive outcomes? And lastly, we cannot, we need to be realistic. Integration is painful, it's expensive, and there will be economic, transformation, industrial transformation. So there will be people adversely affected by ASEAN community building measures. So impact evaluation, both positive and negative, right? Positive we measure, negative. So how can we address these problems so that ASEAN community building can be more holistic, can be less painful, and everyone, well, in the ideal sense, everyone grows and benefits together. Lastly, I come to enforcement, right? So at this point in time, ASEAN has not litigated any of its economic treaties. And of course, soft laws cannot be litigated. So for soft laws, the enforcement, the implementation, the compliance, monitoring and evaluation is the primary mechanism. But what about treaties? We cannot rule out one day that, ASEAN economic treaties might be litigated, right? So that is something that we need to bear in mind. Now, when that could possibly happen, right? Where especially when in ASEAN external economic relations, when our dialogue partners have economic treaties with ASEAN and they want to gain the benefits from an integrated ASEAN Economic Community. And if the outcomes, the promises do not happen, we should not forget and we cannot rule out that litigation might happen. And if external litigation happens or the threat of external litigation happens, that might pressure intra-ASEAN economic litigation as well, right? So this is a changing landscape. You know, I'm just sketching out the possibilities of legal compliance, legal enforcement, and because as ASEAN's rules-based order solidifies, develops, and complexifies, these are all factors that we need to bear in mind. Of course, apart from traditional dispute settlement via tribunals and arbitration, we need to look at mediation and conciliation as well. So we cannot rule them out, and they may be very effective and also might evolve into a very ASEAN way of dispute settlement as well. So lastly, let me go into policy recommendations. Coming back to the basics, we need to understand, what the ASEAN rules-based order really wants. It is about, we need to implement better. We need to have greater transparency and more effective monitoring, right? And not rule out the possibility of litigation in the future. Re-emphasizing Myas's point about the private sector involvement. And I think lastly, in terms of community building, we need to be realistic in terms of our targets, not over-ambitious. And also, this applies to the timelines and the institutions as well as ASEAN's rules in making our community ambitions happen. So in that sense, also in reference to Myas's point, we need to reduce the jargon and really do what we promised to do. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. Maybe I just for a few minutes just try to highlight some of the the common threads that's coming out of some of the chapters here, and also from our presentations today. I think one which was brought up also by Julia is that increasingly some of the emerging challenges, whether it's digitization, sustainability, these are cross-cutting in nature, cross-pillar as well. And I think there's a need to have a much more effective coordination platform for this. And plus it involves different stakeholders, private sector has been mentioned a few times, but also others, NGOs and even think tanks, right? So having a kind of multi-stakeholder platforms, I think Myers talks about that as well in PPPs. It's a good idea, and I think certainly other international organizations have been doing it quite effectively, including APEC. I think you talked about that, bringing different stakeholders together to talk about different strategies and initiatives, and also bring them early in terms of conceptualizing these projects so that you have more effective implementation of that particular project. Implementation as well as monitoring. I think Sunny talks a lot about that too. I mean, we're no short of different kinds of strategic blueprints and all kinds of action plans at the regional level, right? But once it goes down to a national level, it's a challenge in terms of trying to get them enacted. And I think all of us have experience in that. And I think Stanley has also talked about finding ways to have much more effective monitoring systems, feedback mechanisms, and there's a new M&E framework, right? Hopefully that, and you talked about that too. So hopefully that would help to some extent in getting a lot of these initiatives implemented and complied by member states. Also in the chapters that we looked at, I think there were a number of recommendations based on these emerging issues like narrowing the development divide, and also on sustainability, where they call for something that ASEAN doesn't like very much, new institutions, right? Or they call it, it could be a new coordinating body or committee. But I think it does, I think for special circumstances, particularly when you're dealing with kind of a new cross-cutting issue or emerging issue, I think that there's merit in creating such a body to help to actually implement this and to get it and to operationalize and mainstream that to sectoral bodies. One idea which I brought up as well we brought up in our concluding sector is that if that's another possible way is, maybe to create kind of a Friends of the Chair group on a particular topic or area with a clear sunset clause that, we're going to get this all done within 2 years, and then we're going to close shop once it's been mainstream into the sectorial borders. And it's also been, and there's a sense of ownership, which is another thing that was brought up by different stakeholders. I think that would be quite crucial. Okay, let me take a look at some of the questions that we have on the floor here. I think what I'll do is I'll start off with questions which are kind of directed at our authors, and then we'll move on to some of them which are covered by the other chapters. Right, there's one question here related on reducing roadblocks to harmonizations and MRAs, mutual recognition agreements. Can you identify 1 or 2 specific actionable and concrete recommendations to move this forward? How exactly do we do this? Maybe this is for Myers and even Stanley. I think because MRAs is that a soft law? I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can let me know. But Myers first.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis, and thanks for that question. Actually, that's probably one of the hardest questions, even for governments to answer in the region. But just probably providing more from a practical, more pragmatic point of view on how the roadblocks could be somehow we can overcome the roadblocks to having or to achieving harmonization and even MRAs. I actually find in ASEAN and even other trade blocs, they've always emphasized on consensus. All right, it's always about consensus. For me, it's very difficult to come up to consensus, to have consensus when it involves more than 2 countries. Right. So for me, why don't we, instead of having consensus, why don't we just go to the majority? Like a 50% plus 1 kind of thing, instead of focusing on making sure that everyone agrees to one idea, when we all know that's very impossible given the different levels of developments of each country. So for me, that's one way to actually address or overcome the roadblocks to harmonization and MRAs. I'll give you an example why the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, there's actually a commitment in identifying non-tariff barriers. Why it was never effectively implemented. It's basically because for a trade measure or non-tariff measure to be considered a non-tariff barrier, it needs consensus. So all the 10 countries should agree that a non-tariff measure of one specific country, ASEAN country, is a non-tariff barrier. Come on. Let's be honest here. Would that country implementing the non-tariff measure tell everyone that, yes, I'm implementing a non-tariff barrier? Come on, let's be honest here. No one, right? So for me, that's probably one practical way to overcome the roadblocks to harmonization and even come up with the MRAs. Yeah. So in case Julia, Denis, or Yandy would want to add something to it.
Yeah, well, let me just try to run through these questions first, and there are a couple of more general questions which many of us can actually answer, including myself. But there's one here that's directed at Stanley, which is from my colleague, Miguel. While Stanley makes a good case for the existence of a rule-based order, how viable is adherence to such an order when member states may be forced to set this aside in pursuit of their own interests in the shadow of renewed great power competition in the region cannot ignore. Basically, how can this be sustained when interests may pull members in another direction? Long question.
So yeah, it's a very good question. So it depends on whether we are asking about this. It seems to be a more APSC, a political security question rather than an economic question, right? So because for ASEAN, economic agreements, they are treaty obligations, and I am not so sure. And of course, ASEAN economic treaties, and every ASEAN member state would also have their bilateral economic treaties and are members of other multilateral economic treaties. So, and in this kind of mesh of economic treaties, I am not so sure, right? That favoring, one party might always lead to a complete rupture or violation of all the other economic treaties. So in that sense, even if it's pulled in another direction, it might be very simplistic to say that, but generally in my understanding and my limited view of economic agreements in the world is that they are kind of overlapping, and it's and if there's going to be a violation, right? Okay, of course the WTO dispute settlement system is hanging in there, so you can't litigate there anymore, but there could be other negative outcomes when there are economic violations. So pulling in another direction might not it might impede, it might slow down, but it might not rupture or be an express violation of ASEAN economic obligations. So that's my short answer. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. Okay, there are some questions here which are related to some of our authors, and I think I don't know whether Julia or would want to just take a crack at it. I think one of them is to do with the development divide. So he's broken up into two questions. What strategies can ASEAN adopt to address the economic divide and promote more inclusive development within the region? Also, how can policies and initiatives be tailored to support the economic growth and integration of less developed ASEAN member states? I think Julia would probably talk more, but I think that chapter does talk about us actually thinking a little bit out of the box in terms of how we address the development divides, not just between the ASEAN 6 and the CLMV countries, but looking at themes, thematic challenges that which is more relevant for the first question. And by the way, if some of these questions, we can also pass it on to the authors, and perhaps we can get them to answer those questions for you if as well. Julia, would you want to say something on this?
Yes, thank you, Denis. So just quickly, so I won't repeat what we have already summarized in the narrowing development gap chapter, right? But basically, how do we then address the different development gaps across like a broader dimensions, including the emerging challenges, the digital transformation, different level of resilience to climate change, for example, different groups in your society that actually exposed differently to the impact of the climate change. People that's actually working outdoor, for example, significantly more affected by climate change than those working in the office. Things like that. I think those are very, very specific. But then, while noting that there is that encouragement that maybe we need to think broader beyond than just certain groups of countries within ASEAN and others. I recall one of the conversations we had, and this is like within the ASEAN circle, where there was actually very direct questions being asked to the least developed countries about what do they actually need. And the answer is actually really quite, I'm not saying simple, but it's actually quite uniform, which is really interesting. And one is actually around infrastructure, right? And that infrastructure means physical, digital, again, hard and soft. Related to this, but not only related to infrastructure, is investment. Are they actually getting enough investment? And are they actually getting quality investment? And the third one that everyone repeatedly highlight is actually on human capital. Are they having enough people trained with the right skills that they need to basically elevate their economy through either higher productivity in the sectors that they are participating in, or even upgrade to more complex sector or aware or sectors where growth are actually more sustainable and resilient. So I think that's that's pretty much part of the questions. I mean, then the others, you have all these same thing that we have heard, things like capacity building, sharing of experiences and all that. But then ultimately, what's also very important is, are we actually bringing the right people to the table, right? So for example, if you want to have a cooperation activities, maybe in sharing best practices in sustainable agriculture and things like that, who should you invite to that to that forum, right? Often within ASEAN, maybe the first group of people that will be invited are people who are actually in the Ministry of Agriculture, but they are not the one that's actually farming, right? So are you actually supposed to be involving a broader level of stakeholders? Maybe you need to be engaging more of your association, farmers group representatives and things like that. So whatever that's being shared will be a lot more applicable to what they're actually doing on the like on the ground. So I think that's pretty much the short policy. But of course, we also have some of those recommendations as well. And I don't know, Denis, do you think if that's okay, I'll just quickly tackle the SDG questions as well?
Yeah, I think that as I think we discussed that in the chat box, that I think our authors didn't exactly address. It's not one of the topics that we did, but maybe just to add that I did have a podcast with someone from the UNSCAP that's been in the Southeast Asian office, Pak Ronnie, and he's been helping the ASEAN member states and ASEAN in terms of trying to achieve the SDG goals. I think there's 17 of them, right? Yeah, go on, Julia.
Yeah, I think just on that, just to flag that ASEAN has a complementarity initiative that come up with a framework to identify what are some of the shared values between the SDG and the ASEAN community vision, as well as what are some of the principles that can help guide them. It also identifies, I think, 5 priority areas of SDG that they could be focusing on, identifying complementarity that includes poverty reduction, connectivity, and so on. But again, I think this is also a classic case that, yes, you have the framework. Are the framework actually sufficiently socialized? Are all the different sectoral bodies clear about what they can and should do with the framework and for what benefits? So again, this is about having a framework in place, a good framework, but what do we do with the follow-up implementation? But on the other hand, when it comes to M&E, I think I also want to share that ASEAN has actually developed SDG indicators. This is a cooperation under ASEAN Statistical Cooperation that becomes actually quite useful in terms of tracking the progress, ASEAN progress towards SDG. I think the baseline report was a launch, if I remember correctly, I think it was in 2020. I don't know, there's probably an updated report come up after that.
Okay, thanks. Maybe this questions might I'll maybe Myers can try take a crack at this one. So they talk about a lot of plans and blueprints in ASEAN, but if you want to convince ASEAN citizens and businesses why AEC matters, what would be one of the compelling reasons why AEC matters to people of ASEAN and essentially businesses, right? What does it matter to them about AEC?
Okay, so probably for it's like a Miss Universe question. But yeah, I think for me, why AEC matters, and it's also one of the reasons why I've always been very interested in doing international trade work. It's bringing people together. So for AEC, it's really bringing people in the region together, regardless of the nationality, the race, the gender. As much as it's not as effective as we want it to be, there's really a strong commitment from all ASEAN countries that everyone is benefiting from AEC. And I think that for me, that what matters in AEC. It's really the genuine commitment or love or care of everyone in the region. Yeah. Thank you.
But I think it's also a question of public out. It's not just something for ASEAN. Also, it's also with other institutions as well. How do you make these institutions relevant, right? And it boils down to what does it matter to if you're a small business owner, right? Or you're an individual. So what? What's AEC? What's WTO, right? So finding ways to reach out to them to see how it benefits their lives, I think is something that needs to be done. Maybe the communications department in these departments will need to work harder on that. Okay, there's one here that's it's actually more for Lily on digital transformation, and it's also related to the development divide too, right? And small, and I guess Myers or Julia, how can the AEC ensure inclusivity in digital transformation efforts, particularly for marginalized communities and smaller businesses? I think it's a tough question, but I don't know whether.
I think maybe quickly. So ultimately, what's most important is on the connectivity and access, right? So this is probably where digital public infrastructure become important. And back then, I think it's also questions of universal service and so on. But I think technology has been so advanced now that hopefully that can help some of these economies or communities actually leapfrog the need to basically build expensive towers and all that in rural areas, because now a lot of it's basically satellite based and so on. But having the connectivity and access alone usually is not enough. Of course, at the ASEAN level, we know that a lot of the work has been on the governance framework, interoperable regulatory cooperations and all that. But it's the capabilities then that becomes very important. So capabilities of maybe those that have less access to digital technologies, that's your digital literacy at the very basic, get that digital literacy. And then later on, whether or not you can also build specific digital skills to apply in your job as well. When it comes to MSMEs, for example, one concern is that, how do you even measure? So how do you actually define when an MSME have actually digitalized? And this is actually the questions that, even in specific countries, I think they're also still working out the questions. I'm sure there are frameworks and all that. But one of the easiest measures usually is, are you actually selling to the digital e-commerce platform? But that's actually not the only way for an MSME to actually digitalize. Some of the, at least maybe not the micro, but at least the small enterprises, it's probably about adopting quite simple softwares, for your business, whether that's for the accounting or the management purpose, that can actually really boost your productivity beyond just selling your products to the e-commerce platform. And then lastly, I think at the most macro level, even when they actually develop tools or then they are promoting their FTAs and so on, are the information and the processes being introduced accessible and understandable to these small enterprises? Having now worked at the national level, we find that user experience becoming extremely important. Myers probably knows this already because you work on this much more closely. At the most, if not all, every time I think there's an initiative, the policy intention is always good. But once the things are being rolled out, sometimes the experience is very different, right? Because we don't see how the users are actually seeing that experience. I mean, it's the same thing, when I was working in ASEAN, there is that intention of actually communicating AEC initiative and progress to everybody. But everything feels we are so close and familiar with everything. And that, the moment you take yourself from that circle and think of it from a general public perspective, it becomes quite difficult to understand, actually.
Yeah, I think the other concern is that, and that will take us to the next question, perhaps, is that digital transformation in some would argue is actually widen the inequality that we see in ASEAN, right? And because whether we like it or not, there are member states which have better digital infrastructure than others. So in a way, you're actually widening the inequality. Hence, initiatives like to try to narrow the development divide becomes even more issue, and that's where I think ASEAN policymakers need to take this issue a bit more seriously, because inequality will widen. And I guess that leads to that it's a kind of a very broad macro question about how has the global trend towards decoupling affected the AEC, and how can the AEC navigate this post 2025, right? There's a lot of discussions in different panels, and I've attended quite a few of these talking about decoupling, and decoupling is kind of, and it all relates to the US-China sort of economic competition and rivalry, and concerns that of global economic fragmentation, which some would argue has started. Some would say it's already started to fragment even before these issues started because of rising inequality, for example, right? And I think this is one of the points of us doing this exercise, right? This book is to try to look at what ASEAN and AEC needs to do post 2025, because we've got these uncertainties in the global environment, right? I don't know if anybody wants to chime in on this. So, any one of you?
This is the questions on the.
Yeah, how has the global trend towards decoupling affected the AEC, and how can the AEC navigate this post 2025? Yeah,
maybe let me try and take a step at this, Denis. And I think, you know, this is, I think, with my other forthcoming publication, this is actually the first recommendations that I put in, that ASEAN really need to think about and discuss their response strategy to this as ASEAN. You know, I think respectively, each of the member states will also need to have their own strategy, but at ASEAN, have a clearer understanding about how they are actually impacted with what's happening, and how should ASEAN respond to this. So how are they impacted? I think to an extent, one of the most direct one might be on the supply chain diversifications and de-risking strategy that different firms and economies are actually undertaking. So that means, I think in this regard, usually the initial analysis is quite positive from the ASEAN side, because a lot of the ASEAN countries thought that, oh, maybe we can benefit from some of this diversification. But I think we also need to note that those benefit quite unevenly distributed among the ASEAN economies across the different sectors, and you know, they are also not automatic. Neither are they necessarily sustainable as well. You know, we read about there's been quite a few of this diversion of trade, you know, coming in through maybe one countries, whether that's in ASEAN or maybe closer to the Western markets, where goods are being further processed and then goes into that particular market. But at some point, you know, the response from some of these countries will also catch up to the fact as well. There's also been some news, for example, that some of the specific ASEAN member states exports have been affected because perhaps of the alleged use of inputs. They might not have met some of the specific standards on, you know, on labor and so on, that has been introduced for security reason. So there is that trade aspect. When you have trade aspect, you might have the inflation impact, and of course you have this investment situation. Lots of the assessment has been done that basically they were saying that there's been a shift in the investment pattern. So you see a higher growth of those countries who are more geopolitically aligned. So it depends on who you and which ASEAN member states, you know, you might actually see a relative a slower growth in investment, and that might affect your future productivity, right? At the institutional level, you also see this proliferation of alternative multilateralism, they call it, right? Of the different countries in the different areas. They will actually engage different countries, sometimes different subsets of the ASEAN member states as well. Now, I mean, there is nothing wrong with it, because they might have like shared interests. But it might become a concern of ASEAN if that comes at the expense of the quality and intensity of engagement of those partners with ASEAN as an institution. You know, if there's like a reduced commitment or focus, not just from the partners, but also from the ASEAN member states themselves, because, you know, they might, you know, some might think that actually there's more benefits in some of that platform. And this is really why it becomes very important for ASEAN to ensure that it continues to offer relevant agenda. And the importance not just goes to the external partners, but it also goes into its own members as well.
Okay, thanks. Lee, do you think that you know, if ASEAN moves towards a much more rule-based system or rule-based order, as you said, would that to some extent help to insulate ASEAN to some of these concerns in the global environment? What do you think?
So I think it would to a, you know, well, maybe not such a vast extent, but I think because ASEAN member states, when they, you know, all the decoupling and then the other, you know, multilateral arrangements or minilateral arrangements, these are also binding treaties, they're also binding rules, right? So I think, you know, just going back to the basics, I would like to reiterate and perhaps in a different way of what Julia has said, you know, ASEAN needs to figure out its game plan. And I think ASEAN member states and ASEAN collectively have to realize that dialogue partners can be very fickle, right? They give you a goodie one day and it might be a stick the very next day. And also, you can't put all your eggs in one or two dialogue partners' baskets. I mean, the region is here to stay. You should have, you know, you know, just like the stock market, you need to vary, right? And that's realistic, you know, believe in our region, you know, I mean, if you don't work for our region and there is a lot of benefit and growth coming out the region, so that's what we need to reap, right? And obviously, you know, different member states will have different strategies, but the ASEAN collective integration goal should be one of the topmost strategies because, you know, as a bloc, there is a lot of potential and we have also already reaped some of the benefits. So I think it's worth putting in more effort. Yeah.
Myers, you're closer to the ground when it comes to the private sector, and you know, do you hear concerns about this concerns about the coupling between, particularly in supply chains, and is there an ASEAN strategy out of this concern, or what do you hear or see?
Yeah. Probably just to also highlight what Julia has mentioned. So the decoupling actually is benefiting more ASEAN companies in a sense that it increase the opportunities for them, and especially those that are exporting to developed countries. And then in reality, most of ASEAN companies, actually their main market destinations are still the developed countries. And because the homogeneity of the products and services, that's probably where the negative impact would come in, because that means that the competition among ASEAN companies will increase, because then they will be competing in exporting their products and services to those countries globally. Right. And probably that would somehow affect the ASEAN economic integration process, because we've seen some of the countries, the commitments in bilateral FTAs or other mega regional FTAs are deeper, much deeper than what they have in ASEAN. And they implement their commitments in these FTAs, but not their commitments in ASEAN. And that's where Shenli's point in saying that even if they don't implement their commitments, there's no litigation. There's no recourse for them or whatsoever whenever they don't implement their commitments. So that's one thing that I see. It's positive in a sense, because that would provide more opportunities for ASEAN companies, but there's also a possibility, and probably it's happening now, that the competition among ASEAN and companies is also increasing, and there's a possibility that when it comes to deeper ASEAN economic integration, that's probably not going to be the focus or the priority of some of ASEAN countries. So that's the way I see it. I just probably to also add a few points on the digital divide, which you also highlighted earlier. Yes, the digital transformation, digitalization, it can either widen or narrow the gap, right? So I have a very specific example when it comes to this digital transformation. So under the ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement, now they actually transition to electronic certificate of origin, Form D. So yes, that's actually a positive development progress. But those companies that are located in the cities, especially in capital cities, of course, they have good access to good infrastructure, right? But how about companies that are located in rural areas where they don't have access to internet, good internet? So because ASEAN actually, they're now fully implementing the electronic certificate of origin. That means that those companies that are located in rural areas that do not have access to good internet connection, they won't be able actually to submit electronic certificate of origins unless they probably have to go to a city where there's a good internet connection. And that's why I always highlight, when you provide all these kind of initiatives, make sure that you provide all possible options depending on the capacity and the resources of a company. So it shouldn't be only electronic certificate of origin. It should be either the paper-based electronic origin or electronic certificate of origin. Timor-Leste, they're in the process of acceding to ASEAN now. We all know, if you go even to their capital city, Dili, internet connection is not good. So if you say now that under the ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement, only electronic certificate of origins would be accepted, then how can companies in Timor-Leste would be able to export more or import more within the region? So that's how I see it. So make sure that you provide all the possible options for companies, which should be based on their capacity rather than let's just focus on digitalization. So that it doesn't widen the gap.
Mhm.
Also, what I mentioned is make sure that when you do outreach, you go beyond capital cities. And that's why it's very important to tap on business support organizations, because these are the organizations that are directly engaging those that are located outside of capital cities.
But do you see an improve? I think one of the weak links is that relationship between government officials and the private sector. And you made some recommendations how we can build a stronger relationship. But over the years, have you seen that that there is a much more open channel of communication, between the two parties?
Coming from the government myself, I've seen it. So before, probably during my time, and probably that's the reason why I joined the private sector, because I've always been very inquisitive in talking to the businesses. But now I see how the governments are more open to talk to the business sector. Though, of course, as much as possible, they don't want to directly engage the private sector because of the concern or the fear that if they engage the private sector, they always have to say yes to whatever demands the private sector would be. But the way they're doing it now, they actually would engage experts, consultants. So me, for instance, in the Philippines, most of the time they engage me to do industry consultation, to gather business feedback. And for me, that's actually a positive progress from since I started, because before it's always like, no, we just want to focus on negotiating FTAs or agreements, and that's it. There's no conscious effort from the governments or from the trade negotiators to make sure that they gather feedback from the businesses across the country. But now they're doing that.
Right. Okay, thanks, Mayas. I think I've run out of questions in the box as well. Is there any other any last points that you want to raise, any of you? If not, I like to thank all of you for this really great webinar. We've got lots of interesting insights, and for our audience to please do, if you've not read our edited volume, please do download it. It's available on our website, and it's what I call a straight to the point publication. It looks at it does a quick assessment of the issues. It talks about some of the long-standing issues as well as emerging ones, and most importantly, policy recommendation. And this is what we've heard here as well from Julia Myers and Xian Li. So with that, thank you all for tuning in, and please do look forward for some of our future work on ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.